Hi everybody, Zach here, and welcome to the 10th lesson in this RTS tutorial series. In this episode, we'll be setting up one of our user interfaces. So fire up your editor, and let's get started. Hello, so here we are back inside the editor. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our blueprints folder, and I'm going to create a new blueprint folder called widgets. And in this folder, I'm going to right click and go down to user interfaces, or user interface. And I'm going to select blueprint widget, or widget blueprint, sorry. And I'm going to name it GameTime _ HUD. And in here, we are going to create our interface, or user interface for GameTime. And while I'm not a visual artist at all, I'm going to try to make it somewhat pretty. I mean, if you call anything I do pretty. Gonna drag in an image. Gonna set the anchor to the top right corner. And I'm just gonna drag this image box up here. I'm just gonna make it about yay big. A little bit easier to see how big this is in a half a second. And in my color, I am going to set it to a gray tone. This particular gray I've been using every time I've tried to do this recording. So I can get it for a third time. Once in the practice file, once in the test recording, and once now. And that is the value. It's not actually the value, it's close enough. Set that to 0.4, so it's translucent. Remember, our alpha does translucency. There we go. We now have a nice translucent box in this corner. So I'm going to name this box as our background image, or IMG. Now, what I am about to do is a bit backwards. We're going to create the children. We're going to create a whole bunch of panels, and we're going to create the children first. And the reason why we're doing that is I have found that every time I have done this, for my own sort of builds and for my own sort of tests, that I have a lot of issues when I do it the correct way. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take in 4 horizontal boxes that will serve as our date box, our time box, our game speed progress bar, and our game speed control. So drag in the first one, and this will be our date box. And inside our date box, we're going to have a larger spacer towards the front and back, 3 blocks of text, and 2 spacers between the text. So let's grab that first spacer. And while we're on the date box, actually, let's make that size to content. Take that spacer and set it to 5. This value will probably change later on, and I'll show you why. This is making up for the issue of doing it backwards. We're going to drag in a text block. When you drag it in, make sure the yellow line around date box is on the top and bottom. Otherwise, you'll have to set the positioning yourself. We'll name this day text. And for placeholder text, just for the size of it, I'm going to use the number 30. Our first smaller spacer will go in. And I'm going to set this one to a padding of 2. I'm going to grab another text block, not slider, text block, and drag it in. And I'm going to name this one month text. Again, this will be a placeholder, and due to the length of the name of this month being the longest, I'm going to use September. I'm going to grab another smaller spacer, our final small spacer, and I'm going to set the padding on this one to 3. Next, I'll grab our final text block for this section, or this block, or this box, and I'm going to name it year text to keep my naming conventions the same. Speaking of naming conventions, in terms of why I use capitals at the start and can do C++, that's one convention in C++ I never got behind, I never really liked. I know that you have to, but still, or had to actually, and it's now just convention. I never really liked that convention. It bothers me, so I don't have to do it here. I don't. Gonna set this one to 5 in terms of padding on that final spacing. Alright, so our date box is done. Just going to move it in here so we have a rough idea what it will look like. I'm going to grab another horizontal panel. Oh, sorry, horizontal box. And this one I'm going to name our time box. Close this out. We will put a spacer in. We will set the spacer to a padding of 5. And this one will, like the last one, have a spacer at the start and finish. But the spacers inside of this one will be text-based outside of the ones at the start and finish. And one special one we'll talk about in a second. So I'm going to put in a text block. And in this text block, I am going to name it hours text. Of course, I named the space by mistake. Hours text. The time I'm going to set, or the hours I'm going to set, is 23. Again, I'm going to go back to the time box. I'm going to click size to content. I am going to grab another text box, and I'm going to name this one time text spacer 1, and I'm going to put in a colon. After that, I'm going to grab another text block and put it into our time box, and this one will be our minutes text. And for placeholder text, I'm going to use the minute 59. And I am going to put in one more time text spacer from a text block. So time text spacer 2. And what I'm about to do with this, you're going to think I've lost the plot, but I'll explain in just half a second. After that, we are going to drag in another text block and put it at the end. And in this one, we're going to name it seconds special text. And instead of putting a number in, I'm going to put AM. Now, you're probably looking at this going, well, it's military time. We don't need the AM, PM, and if we have AM or PM, we don't need this colon. The reason why I've done this is to remind myself what I'm going to do with it. And what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to create a button that will add to this part of it, actually, this widget, that will toggle between military and civilian time. When it's in military time, this will display seconds, and this colon will appear. When it's in civilian time, the colon will turn into a space, and this will turn into an AM, PM, and this will turn into a 12-hour setup. So I'm going to add in that special spacer I mentioned a little bit ago. And I'm going to set this one to have a spacing of 5. And then I'm going to take a button and drag that in. I'm going to delete the button I just dragged in and drag it into the correct spot. And into the button, I am going to drag a text block. There we go. I'm going to name this button mil civ button. The text I will name mil civ button text, and I am going to put an M/C in there, and I'm going to change the font size to 20. I am going to put one final spacer in at the very end. Just going to close that box out, and I'm going to set the padding to 5. Now that that one's done, I am going to close it out. I'm going to drag in another panel, and this will be, of course, the third horizontal box. This one I am not going to click the size to content. I am going to drag in a spacer. I am going to drag in a progress bar, and I'm going to drag in one more spacer. I'm going to set my spacers each to have a padding of 5. And I am going to set the spacer to fill. I am then just going to click the, not that one, the vertically aligned, so it's a little bit thinner, or a lot thinner. And I am going to name this Game Speed Progress Bar. And I'm going to name the box Game Speed Prog Box. Actually, bar box, just so I know what it is. And I am going to click this box, and I'm going to, actually, first thing I'm going to do, just, again, I know it's not perfect, I'm just going to do this to give myself a rough estimate. I'm going to move this up here. I'm going to try to get it centered underneath, and I'm going to do the same with this one. I'm going to move it here. I'm going to try to get it somewhat centered underneath, and I'm going to extend it out in each direction to get the length I want it at. And that's about the size I want. And that's the reason why we haven't clicked that, is because if we did, it would, this progress bar wouldn't resize correctly. I'm just going to fill it part way up, say around 50%. Doesn't have to be perfect, just so I can see it's filled. And I'm going to drag in one final horizontal box. And this will house the controls for our game speed. And inside here, we're going to put a spacer. Just going to rename this real quick as Game Speed Control Box. Set this spacer to have a padding of 5. And I'm going to drag in a button. I'm going to drag it into the correct spot. A text block. I'm going to drag in another spacer, another button and text block, and yet another spacer, and one final button with one final text block, assuming you don't mess it up like me and have to delete and redo that one. And then, of course, our final spacer. I am having a real hard time with this one. Just going to quickly set that final spacer to have a padding of 5. And I'm going to name this button, button number 3 on my list, as Decrease Speed Button. The text will be Decrease Speed Text. Actually, Decrease Speed Button Text. In the text, I will put 2 open carets. And I'm going to change the font size to half of this to 12. I am going to name this one my pause button. But I will point out that our pause button does not, it pauses a very particular thing. It pauses our game clock. It doesn't pause the tick. I'm going to name the text block inside that button as pause button text. If you don't know what I mean by that, I will explain as we go a little bit further into this section. And inside of here, I'm going to put 2 horizontal lines to represent a pause symbol. Set the font size to 12. I am going to put a space between those because it looks a little bit better with the space, I think. And this will be, this last button will be our increase speed button with our increase, if it would let me type, increase speed button text, and that will be 2 closed arrows. Again, I'm going to set the font size to 12. Why do I feel like this one's bigger somehow? I am just seeing things. So the final thing I need to do is double check why the spacing is slightly off on this last little bit here. Oh, yeah, that's why. We do need to size this one to content. There we go. I don't like how small that is, actually, so let's increase the font size to 16. See how that looks. That one's better. Let's go to 16 on this one as well. And 16 onto this one. I would put 15 into those last two, didn't I? Nope, just into the last one. 16, there we go. And now let's give these to a parent. What we're going to do is we're going to open up our panel. We're going to drag in a vertical box now. And in this vertical box, we're going to take our date box and we're going to put it in there. I'm just going to drag the date box, slide it in there. Vertical box, go back to it, size to content. After that, we are going to need our favorite little things, the spacers. So drag a spacer in, put it in there. And we're going to set the padding on this spacer to 3. We might increase it later on. We're going to grab our time box and we're going to put it in our vertical box now. And we're going to move it down to the 3rd position. Just want to make sure it is in the 3rd position. Grab another spacer. And we'll set this one to have a spacing of 3 as well. We will grab next our game speed progress bar. Drag it into our vertical box there. And we'll take another spacer. And we'll put it in that vertical box. We'll give it a value or a padding of 3. And then finally, we will take our game control box and move it in there as well. And there we go. We have everything in that box, nice and neat, except for now it's not lined up correctly. So let's fix that. Let's grab our game speed and let's set that to be horizontally aligned. We'll leave it vertically where it's at right now. We'll do the same for this one. Ooh, no, we won't. We will just do the horizontally aligned, the vertically aligned with that one. With our time box, we will do the horizontally aligned. And with our date box, we will do horizontally aligned as well, even though it already is. Finally, we can name this big box for the big vertical box now as our GameTime HUD, or GameTime box HUD. And I'm going to drag it into here. And I'm going to set the anchor to that top right corner. Compile and save. We are now done setting up our HUD. We won't have any functionality of it yet. And it won't even show up in our game yet. But let's do that last bit. Let's make it so it shows up in our game so we know that it's working. So go back to our blueprints, go to our player controller, open it up, and we're actually going to need to go in there right away, but I just wanted to get us back to the event begin play. We're going to add in 2 new references. We're going to do one in our reference cast, and we're going to do one down here off this first pin. So in our reference cast, let's go in there and disconnect our camera pawn from our output. We can drag that out. And from here, let's right click and type in get player controller. Off our not player controller, get game state. We are the player controller right now. Get game state. And from here, we're going to cast to our RTS game state that we made in the last episode. And we're going to hook up our set to our cast. And off our as our game state, we are going to promote to variable. And we're going to name this game state ref. And from this ref, drag to our output. Move the reference into our references. And I am just going to type in my tooltip here, which is game state reference called in cast references. Cast references. Begin play. Compile and save. Close that out. Next, we will need to create a widget. And our widget will be, not our widget, a macro. Our new macro will be to get our other reference. And this will be our spawn widgets reference. This will be our references to our widgets. Right now we only have one, but we will have multiple as this goes on. Just like before, this will be labeled execute of type execute, and the output will have a then of type execute. this will be a on play, so I'm just going to move it up there right now. And in this, we are going to drag off our execute, and we're going to create widget. This widget will be our game time HUD. We'll drag this out just a tiny bit. From our owning player, back drag and type in self, get reference to self. From our return value, promote to variable. This will be our HUD game time ref. Okay, I'm going to actually put an underscore there. Game time ref. This is, of course, a reference, so it's going to go into references. And hook up the set to the output. Compile, save. Close out our widget. And then drag that new widget into our event graph. Connect it to the first dot there, or the first pin, labeled 1, not the actual first pin. And then the next thing we need to do is we actually need to add this to the viewport. So now that we've created the reference and cast to the HUD and have created the widget, we need to actually spawn it on the viewport. So drag the reference to our game time HUD out and drag off of that. Type in add to viewport. Hook up the executes. There we go. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to drag off of here, and we're going to do, sorry, we're not going to drag off of there yet. We're going to create a function first. And this function will be called set HUD visibility. We are going to set it to, we're going to make it a category on its own called HUD. And we're going to do things backwards. Instead of adding the outputs or inputs directly here, we're going to back drag and add them in. I'm going to take my game time reference, I'm going to get it, and I'm going to drag off of it and type in set visibility. I'm going to hook up the execute pins, if I can do this without dragging everything around like I'm drunk. And off this invisibility, I'm going to back drag and hook it into the set HUD visibility. It creates a new input called invisibility, not as an invisible, but as in relation to you'll see in a second. I am going to rename it, however, to my game time HUD. And the reason I'm going to do that is we're going to have other ones coming off here down the road. So I'm going to close this. I'm sorry, I'm going to compile and save. I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to drag this new reference off this execute from the add to viewport. And I want it to be visible. So our other options are to be collapsed, hidden, hit test invisible, or set self hit test invisible. So compile and save, and I'm going to hit play. Hopefully my time will show up. It does. As you can see, nothing's happening because we haven't set up the functionality yet. All that's just placeholder text. Our clock is still working, as you can see over here. And everything is set up in our HUD. So next week, we're going to add functionality. We'll get this to actually tell the correct date. We'll get the time to count up. We'll switch between military and civilian time. And we'll hopefully set up the game speed as well. I might split this into 2 separate lessons, depending on how long it takes to record. I might split the first 2 bars into one, the progress bar and the game speed itself into a second one. But we'll see as we go. That said, I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. Likes really help the channel. It boosts the ratings. It gets us out there a bit more. So yeah, please drop a like. If you have any feedback, anything that's worked or not worked in how I'm doing these tutorials, please leave a comment. Let me know about what you think. Let me know what you think I should include or what you think I should drop. And again, I hope to see you next week. And as always, I hope that you have a wonderful day.